Hey, what's going on, folks? It's Gino here. I'm going to talk to you for a little while about everything. I'm going to talk to you about what I think, the universe, life, death, why we're here, and anything else that's going to come into my mind. My underlying presumption about the universe is that it's a kind of computer. And I know that's going to put a lot of people off when I say that, but I hope you'll stick with me so I allow myself to explain my perspective and how I've come to this conclusion. So, I know that people are familiar with the theory that the universe is some kind of simulation. And while it does appear possible that should we be able to reach the technological evolution required to produce a simulation, it's quite likely we would go ahead and make one and then live inside it for technological reasons to assist with our existence. I don't actually think that that's what's happened. I mean, it may happen, and it could happen, and it probably will indefinitely happen, but I don't think that that's the root cause of the universe. I think it just passes the buck to explain it in that way. So I'm actually going to just subtly move past that and proceed with my general understanding that I've come to. So it seems quite reasonable to me that mathematics appears to be a very fundamental language when describing reality. And because I can't alienate this fact from any other part of my understanding of existence, it somewhat persuades me into the belief that should a calculation, an expression, a formula, should some kind of calculation have existed before the universe did, that calculation would actually have born the computer required to calculate it. Now, I don't mean this in a kind of spiritual way, though I do know it sounds awfully metaphysical. But what I mean is, if we understand mathematics to be the foundation of the universe, is it not somewhat a small step to then imagine that the maths came first and the ability to compute the maths came afterwards? And therefore that would provide a reason for the universe's existence. That every particle, every being, every element, every object is itself contributing to this calculation of whatever original piece of computation there was that needs to be resolved. Often when I look at evolution, for example, I see that it is performing a kind of calculation. There is a function in action, and that there is, given an environment, a certain solution. And that through natural selection and the evolutionary process, you are able to have a kind of ongoing arithmetic that ends up deciding the optimum form given a certain environment. And while those environments change, we're further elaborating on that original equation. And in that way, I can reconcile the notion that the universe's ultimate destiny is to reach some sort of perfectly steady, equalized state. That entropy will ultimately be the resolution of this calculation. And that we understand that the mathematics involved in the movement of elementary particles is incredibly complex. And when you have some understanding of acoustics and how they're able to produce certain sounds, and that actually a given sound or a series of sounds to us is actually just a combination of waveforms happening all at the same time that the universe calculates on our behalf for us, it really does bring to mind some quite inspiring interpretations of what the universe really might be. I've never been particularly religious or spiritual. However, I can't exclude the possibility of there being a metaphysical beyond what I can appreciate. And specifically my endeavors in multidimensional mathematics and trying to visualize it with geometry has often made me think that there is sort of almost an alienated area, though things are interconnected and complex, that actually are just derivations of very simple functions. And as you add layers of abstraction, the emergent property is complexity that we see around us and we experience as reality. So essentially, my view of it being that when I pass my genes on, if I am able to do so, that is contributing to the overall calculation for finding a solution for the partial equation that is presented to us on this world of the universe exploring its own possibility, and that given time, more complex mechanisms are naturally reached just through the operation of the basic fundamental particles, that these further emergences are able to contrive more and more complexity. And these all actually are contributing on the same scale. And it's a very natural progress. And this leads me to believe that the solution for this mathematical equation, for this computation, has actually already been found and was resolved before the universe was even created. Before the universe began to exist, the formula was both existed and computed, but there was no proof of the formula, and that the universe was created out of the imperative and necessity for the entire computation to be proofed and actualized. And this is how I resolve internally for me the notion that time is only a perception, and that actually all of time has already existed, and we're just going through the motions of it from our perception, because we're in this part of the computer that is only dealing with these certain segments it's been assigned to find solutions for in response to the greater overall computation. And I find that this belief, this theory, it doesn't offer me a lot of solace in the knowledge of my eventual death. But what it does is it brings at least into context the apparent absurdity of my life. And that when I can acknowledge that my very existence was simply a part of the process in the universe performing the computation that it was born into being to do, to resolve the answer that had already existed, that at least reduces my individual responsibility, because that lets me know that all of this really has already happened. But we are existing inside the mechanism that's writing the proof for it. Alright, I'm going to move on to a topic a little bit abstracted from that, but nonetheless related. And this is the notion that while we experience 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension, there are likely other dimensions in existence, at least from a mathematical perspective. And this influences my thinking greatly in terms of religious belief. So, in religions, we often have deities with extraordinary powers, and well, they seem extraordinary from our perspective. But at least in the Christian tradition, we have beliefs that emanate surrounding abilities to be omnipresent and omnipotent, for example. And I would derive this to being similar to the very famous example that Carl Sagan gives about the separation between the second dimension and the third dimension, and the individual representations therein and how you would perceive them. And while the Flatlander, the man in 2 dimensions, he moves and he turns and he perceives separate areas around him while they are within his sight, within his ability to perceive, the third dimensional being can appreciate the entire apparent universe for the Flatlander, for the 2-dimensional being, at one time. He can simply see it all. He can see the entire sheet of paper or whatever it is that the Flatlander exists upon, all at the same time. And similarly, when the 3-dimensional character interacts in 2 dimensions, he appears to come from absolutely nowhere, because he doesn't proceed from a 2-dimensional vector, he proceeds from the 3rd dimension. So it appears the 2-dimensional individual like that's emanating from essentially thin air, from nothing. And I think this aligns very closely with descriptions given in holy texts surrounding supernatural beings, that they appear to know beyond their ability, or beyond the ability you would allot them from a 3-dimensional perspective, if they were agents only in the 3rd dimension. And I think it also gives us an inkling as to why they would be able to appear without necessarily following a 3-dimensional trajectory. So they would have a 4th-dimensional trajectory that essentially makes them come out of thin air for us. And also, I find that some of the representations of these beings in Scripture also seem to define them as having features that we may sometimes associate with our visualizations of 4-dimensional objects. Quite a famous one is from Isaiah, where it says that this a winged being that has 6 wings. And there's another one that comes from my limited knowledge of South Asian culture that has deities that have multiple arms or faces in several directions. And there's many depictions in folklore that show supernatural beings pointing in 2 directions at once, which may be, for me at least, an expression of how to communicate multidimensionality. So if you tried to point to where the 4th dimension was, you would essentially be pointing either at nothing, because in the 3rd dimension, or you would have to do 2 opposing points or more to indicate that it's actually movement outside of those dimensions. And this is why it's so fascinating to think that, what, from the Flatlander's perspective, how can he influence or impact or interact with the 3rd dimension? And you can imagine he would walk, thousands of miles in his 2-dimensional plane and never find any bridge or access into the 3rd dimension. And I suspect many people in the 3rd dimension have done that as well, and they've gone on these pilgrimages and they've searched out from the occult to find supernatural entities or abilities to access. And while my knowledge of physics isn't amazing, I do understand that, for example, in nuclear reactors and in stars, there are elements and particles that are released that are highly uninteractive with normal matter. And it appears to me that one way of at least representing that, possibly, would be to have the majority of their physical assemblage in a further dimension that's outside of the 3 dimensions we're familiar with. So, for example, neutrinos, very difficult to interact with. However, they do move very fast and they carry a lot of energy. And I imagine on some level of that, and also we could term virtual particles in the same way, maybe the true interaction there is actually happening dimensionally outside of the 3 spatial dimensions we're familiar with. And so this would bring me to the idea, as I said, in terms of a religious context, being that maybe there are either objects or true agents in external dimensions that have at some point interacted with human beings. And when apparently supernatural things happen, this is this nature of interaction. And I know, at least from the small amount of Bible study that I've done, that there is historically in the Bible a lot of implications, a lot of assertions that these beings would interact with humans regularly, but that actually changed over time to a point where there was a flood, there was a castigation of these beings or agents from doing these interactions in the 3rd dimension. And so, from my perspective, that'd be something like an interdimensional police force essentially made it illegal to interact with the 3rd dimension because they realized there was conscious agents inside it and said, all right, better that we don't allow these interactions. However, that would also lead me to believe on some level that perhaps there is some illegitimate interactions still taking place, and maybe there are 4-dimensional beings that still do have some impact in the world as we understand it. But that would raise some very interesting questions as to what would be the motivation for them to do that. And I suspect that actually we do have some way of interacting with additional dimensions beyond the 3 that we're familiar with. And I've come up with a number of really thin, speculative ideas about why this might be or how we could do this. But one of the more romantic ones that I enjoy to speculate about is this idea that singing or sound, somehow sound vibration, is able to transmute in resonance into additional dimensions. And I know it's kind of wishy-washy, quantum woo, and so trying not to be too pseudo about it, I don't allow myself to get overly romantic. But I do think there's something very intrinsically interesting about sound. And again, holy books go on about it at length, that sound is really specifically intriguing for worshipping purposes. And I don't think that's just we like the sound of singing, though we do. I think it is something perhaps a little bit more profound. And then when you view scripture in this way, you can argue, therefore, that the scripture is in fact written in a sort of mythological context to give explanations and exposition to people who wouldn't understand the scientific ramification of what they're involved in, but would give them some inkling of the correct procedure to address it with. And so that's why I think they're written in the style they are, but I think hopefully we're now coming to a point where decoding that and understanding that those who wrote it really did have a thorough understanding of what we would call science today. They really did understand what was going on, but they understood that communicating it required finesse and interpretive expression. Nevertheless, I am conscious of the notion that there are interdimensional beings, potentially. If I can admit that, we're at least 3-dimensional and we exist, does that rule out the possibility of a 4th dimension having free agents that also exist? I don't think so. I think that it is at least possible. They wouldn't be living in the terms that we would imagine what life is like, but it would be something else. I often think about this, if I'm the Flatlander and I get picked up and taken off of the 2-dimensional plane and somehow fall through the 3rd dimension, how do you breathe? Right? Will lungs function in the same way in the 4th dimension? What's 4th dimensional oxygen and elements like? What kind of interactions do they have? And And then that also makes me think, well, what if there's elements of us that already exist in those dimensions, we simply can't perceive them? So there are additional dimensions, and the reason that we do interact with them, or we are of interest to interdimensional beings, is because some part of us is already there, and that's what's having influence. And therefore, moving us in 3 dimensions seems to have a residual effect in the 4th, or 5th, or however many. But again, I think my core belief there is that it's actually music, something to do with singing or sound or something like that. Actually, that the harmonizations, I think that has some penetrative ability, like taking a pen and just jamming it through the plain paper, jamming it through the 2nd dimension to provide a kind of ladder into the 3rd. I think maybe singing does offer something like this. But again, that's highly romanticized and that's highly speculative. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's exactly the truth. I'm just going to say it's my wanton belief that there's something to that. But yeah, okay, I think I've spilled enough of my guts on those things. But those are my takes. Those are actually the understandings I'm operating under at the moment. And I know it's not everyone's take, and I know some people are much more fundamental and they will find it to be a detraction that I even speculated in this fashion. That it's not just merely the obvious literal truth. However, for my own well-being, I perceive it in this way, and I think it does make it is cognitive and sensible, even if a bit radical. And this is one of the subjects I'd love to hear feedback on. So please, if anyone's got any ideas or even contradictions which I've overlooked, I'm absolutely open to them, because I feel like I can work on those, maybe even incorporate them. The refinement is what's of interest to me, not just being validated. Because validation will come when you actually are right. So you don't need to seek it when you're not. Alright, thanks very much. Catch you guys later.